Have you ever read a sentence that you never wanted to forget, and yet a few weeks later you realize that you have forgotten it and you've got no idea how to go about finding it again? This is one of the reasons why I keep a Commonplace book. After I shared my notebook system with you a couple of months ago, a lot of people asked about commonplacing. So today I'm going to share with you what a Commonplace book is, why you should even consider having one, and how to create one that is simple and sustainable. So at its heart, a Commonplace book is a place for you to collect things, which is generally words that are worth keeping. These are not your thoughts. These are not daily reflections. It's not a diary, but it's a notebook that contains words, ideas, and fragments that are important to you. So whenever you read a sentence you love, or come across an interesting fact, or hear something memorable or funny, or you come across a beautiful turn of phrase, you copy that into one central location, and that is your Commonplace book. And unlike a journal or a diary, which is generally chronological, a Commonplace book is more centered around the ideas as opposed to the date that you've captured them. Like your own personal reference book that you've built over time. It isn't a scrapbook. It is not a junk journal. It is really just a place for you to keep these words that have meaning to you, that you want to remember and reflect on later, and it becomes this kind of a personal encyclopedia. And once you fill that book, then you just start another one. You don't start it on January 1st, anything like that. You just go as long as there are pages in that book. So commonplacing itself goes back centuries. It's really an old traditional concept, usually by philosophers and writers and theologians who wanted to keep their ideas in a central location, or quotations, or arguments, or observations. And I like to think of it as a way of preserving ideas before there were search engines. And in many ways, it really did become this early form of a second brain. But one of the things I really love the most about Commonplace books is it becomes a reflection of who you were at that time you felt that information memorable. It's the things you noticed, the things you lingered over, the things that caught your attention. And in 10 or 20 years' time, the things that I write in my Commonplace book are going to be very different to the things that are catching my attention now. And I think that difference kind of tells a story as well. So this is my Commonplace book. It's a very small one. It's from Starsmead Bookbinding in the UK, and it's about 3 years old. And I think when I started this book, it was really around the desire to keep a collection of words. Like I would come across a word and I'd be like, that's a fantastic word. Like the collective noun for a group of cats is a clouder of cats. And those little things kind of interested me. So I started there, but then it became a little bit wider, where I kept things like recipes or other quotations, copy texts, and all of those things would be categorized into different areas. And one of my favorite resources when it came to commonplacing and kind of creating my own rules was this book, which is an Englishman's Commonplace book from Roger Hudson. At the time I got this book, I wanted some examples of what a Commonplace book was actually about. But what I got from this was the introduction that really showed me what should be kept inside a Commonplace book. And it really helped me kind of create my own rules about what I do and don't include. So Hudson talks about how it's important your Commonplace book includes variety. It shouldn't all be quotes from one person or about one particular topic. It should have variety. It should have a little bit of the elevated alongside the ridiculous, which I think is important. And some of his categories are completely random, which I think really shows how unique and personal a Commonplace book becomes. Like my preferred topics or categories are not going to be your categories. And I think that was a really interesting lesson that I took from this. Another beautiful example of a Commonplace book is the Country Commonplace book by Miranda, who's a fellow YouTuber. And this is a little bit different, where this is a really curated, seasonal, specific Commonplace book. While most Commonplace books have a variety of categories, this is an example of how a Commonplace book can be one theme. So it's ideas around the country, around the seasons in the country. So it's another example, and it's a really beautiful curated option to look at. I guess the idea is that with these examples, they become a source of inspiration as your own Commonplace book becomes an inspiration source over time. And then there's my own little Commonplace book. And the key thing is that they are all different. They all have different purposes and different information within them, but that's kind of the beauty of it. So why should you keep a Commonplace book? And there are actually a number of reasons why, but I'm going to try and distill it down into just a few reasons that I think are really important. Over time, your commonplace book becomes a preservation of your intellectual life, which I think is really important. Mine includes excerpts from books, quotes, poems, some recipes, a few completely random funny things I found interesting. For me, the mixture of information is really important and that I continually add to it over time. For example, when I started my commonplace book, I had a category called the seasons because I only just started putting in some information around it. But now I've gotten so much information in here around specific seasons, I can now expand that out to actually having categories around summer and winter and spring and so on. You should include a little bit of the ridiculous alongside the elevated and sometimes a little bit of vulgarity, which I've adopted that into my particular commonplace book. Having a commonplace book makes you a more active reader. Since I've started keeping this commonplace book, I just interact differently with my reading. I notice more, I retain more, and I do engage more deeply in my reading. And I think if you are the kind of person who, when you are trying to recount something to someone else, you're trying to remember a quote or a saying or something, and you have to reach for your phone to find the information, a commonplace book can be really valuable because just the act of sitting with the information for longer, you read it, you make a note of it, then you copy it into your book, you retain the information for longer. You begin to internalize what it is that you're copying out. And I really do think that writing something by hand is also part of that. You can keep a commonplace book digitally, but I think the beauty of it is a hard copy, handwritten commonplace book is simply beautiful. I also see a commonplace book as a bit of a time capsule. Over time, I am collecting ideas and fragments that are important to me and reflect who I am as a person at this particular time in my life. Because in the process of collecting these moments, I'm creating a memoir of my interests. It's not a record of my daily life, but it is a record of what is capturing my attention. And I think that is very important in today's day and age. We live in a time where our attention is being constantly pulled into different directions in short bursts. Clickbait titles, infinite scrolling, snippets of information, and notifications. Information is coming to us in fragments, and that is fragmenting our attention span, or at least it was fragmenting mine. And I feel that commonplacing gently pushes against that trend. It really asks you to slow down. You have to sit with the information for a while before you decide whether it is worthwhile keeping in your commonplace book. You copy it out by hand, and all these things combined gather your attention into one place. And years from now, when I flip through my commonplace book or books, I'll be able to flip through them and see what things captured my interest at that particular time in my life. And in a world that is constantly vying for our attention, it feels quietly powerful and a little subversive to be able to keep a commonplace book. So let's talk about how to keep a commonplace book, and these are some of the rules that I follow when it comes to the information I put into the book. First of all, I think being selective is essential, that this is not a notebook for everything. So if I see something that I think I want to remember, I will either mark the page in some way or I will take a photo and then I will just put it away and forget about it for a while. After I finish a book, I put it into a dedicated pile on my desk. And the reason I do this serves two purposes. The first is that is the pile of books that I'm going to do in my monthly wrap up with you guys. And secondly, when I come to do my commonplacing, I have that pile of dedicated books that I can flip through and see what information I initially captured that I want to now put into my book. I think giving yourself time is really essential, at least a day before you put something into your book. If it still feels meaningful days later, then it has earned a place in your book. I also try and keep entries quite short. If it is any longer than one of these pages, then I either need to be more selective about what is in that I want to keep, or it doesn't belong in this particular book. And I also try not to overfill the book from one particular source. I could put in just quote after quote from Joan Didion, but I don't want this to be a commonplace book about Joan Didion. I want it to have variety. So try and be selective with that. It can be very tempting to copy quotations that you see in books or on Pinterest or on social media, and I would highly recommend that you avoid doing that if possible. Because the joy of the commonplace book is that you have found it through your reading. However, if I do come across one of those things that I think that is a really great little nugget that I think I want to keep, then I will try and find the original source of that information to understand the context around it. And that's kind of led to some interesting books that have crossed my bedside table, so to speak, that I probably wouldn't have found otherwise. For example, I think I continually kept coming across quotes from Vida Sackville-West, which has encouraged me to actually find some of her books rather than stick with the quotes that I've heard someone else has captured. And it's really led to a much richer reading journey of my own. And commonplacing should genuinely reflect that journey of yours, rather than being curated for appearance. When I read physical books, I'm quite selective about the information I want to highlight. I don't want it to be me going through an entire book after I've finished it just to see the information I want to keep. So if I'm reading a physical book, I will either dog ear the lower page, or I will tab it if I don't want to mark the pages. If I can't do that, I will take a photo of the page and highlight the text specifically using the camera app on my phone. Those images I can easily find because your phone now sorts things into screenshots or images about documents or writing, so you can easily find them. But the key is to don't go hunting for information just to fill the pages of your commonplace book. It really should just arise naturally out of your reading life. And that way your commonplace book really reflects who you are rather than who you think you should be. Interestingly, I think indexing is one of the most important parts of commonplacing, and I think there is a lot of current commonplaces who are merging ideas of journaling and junk journaling with commonplacing, and they're doing away with the indexing or really simplifying it down to just 2 or 3 points. So this is my current index, and I think what indexing does is it really makes you consolidate your thinking. You have to think a little strategically. This piece of information, does it fit within this index? If it's completely random, maybe it doesn't fit in my book, or maybe it's a new category that I think maybe needs to be included in my book. And because you are not dating entries, the index is the only way you're going to find the information. So rather than just having 2 or 3 categories of quotes, copy text, recipes, or ideas, I really think you should get specific. And some of my categories recipes, language and words, books, writers and writing, longevity, art, nature, life and death, photography, places, people. It's getting more and more specific, and I just write down the category and then I put the page number after it so I can easily find it. But the more specific you are, the easier it will be to find it later, and trust me, you will want to be able to find what you have put in here later. I would also recommend that if you do commonplacing, really make it a ritual. It is not often that you get to sit down with a pen and paper and write stuff out. So I do make it a ritual. I sit down with my book, I get my fountain pen, I light a candle, maybe put on some music, and just know that I'm going to sit there for a while and just go through the information I've captured and put the things that are still sticking with me in the commonplace book. I recommend that you have a notebook that you enjoy using, paper that you enjoy writing on, a pen that really makes the experience lovely. I personally prefer to use a fountain pen. I love the look of it on here. I have tried to use just normal pen and I don't like the look of that. So find what works for you. For me, copying things out is part of the pleasure of having a commonplace book. It's quiet, it's deliberate, it's a little meditative, and it really feels like a ritual as opposed to a task that you need to accomplish. So how can you start your commonplace book? I highly recommend, if you want to begin, just start with a notebook you own. Chances are high you have received or bought a notebook, written 1 or 2 pages and then not come back to it. Start with that book. It doesn't have to be fancy, it doesn't have to be big. Mine's tiny, and I have learned that probably the next one I get will be a bit bigger. But I'm sure if you stick with commonplacing, and when you get to your next book, you will find ways to make it pleasurable with a really beautiful notebook and a beautiful pen. I do think that in the beginning of your commonplace book, it's okay to be a little less selective because you're creating the bones of the book. And what you may find is that as you start doing it, the categories that you think you want to have in here are perhaps the things that you're not coming across so much in your reading. So it's an interesting discovery process too. But don't just limit yourself to books as the source of information either. It could be song lyrics, newspaper clippings, essays, articles, something that you overheard someone else say, definitions. You could even sketch in here if you wanted to. It's entirely up to you. I once heard on Downton Abbey Lord Crawley say the word squiffy, and it sent me down this rabbit hole of trying, what does that word mean? And then, of course, I entered it into my book later because I have a weird fascination with those sort of words. But so it may not be something that you read, it could be something that you overhear somewhere else. And in terms of formatting, my preferred formatting is to simply have the text, and then underneath I have the source of the information, and it's important to remember to number your pages. Remember that neatness is not your goal, usefulness is. I've actually made a downloadable guide that you can download in the description box below, which has all of these tips that I've given you just in a really neat format, and you can use that as your guide moving forward. So in today's culture of performative everything, I really want to encourage you that commonplacing doesn't have to be perfect. There is no schedule, there is no aesthetic standard, there is no right way to do it. Your commonplace book should simply be a quiet place to gather the information that is meaningful to you. And over time, it becomes something really deeply personal. It becomes a record of your reading life and of your attention. If you already keep a commonplace book, I would love to hear about it in the comments. And if you don't, I hope this is your sign to start one. But who knows, maybe in a few years, your commonplace book may be the most important and meaningful book on your shelf. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you start your own commonplace book. And thank you so much for joining me. Have a wonderful week of reading ahead, and I'll speak with you soon. Bye.